So this is lecture 3 of How the Bible Became the Bible by Rabbi Lawrence Troster at Kesher Israel Congregation in Westchester, Pennsylvania. And tonight, it's September 29th. Tonight we're going to look at the Dead Sea Scrolls and how important they are for our understanding of the development of both the text and the composition of the Hebrew Bible. I mean, they're absolutely critical. In the Wall Street Journal on June 1st, 1954, this ad appeared. I really think it's hilarious. Biblical manuscripts dating back to at least 200 BC are for sale. This would be an ideal gift to an educational or religious institution by an individual or group. This actually was some of the Dead Sea Scrolls that were for sale. Now, the term Dead Sea Scrolls is a broad term that's applied to a lot of different texts, not all from one place. And more accurately, they're usually called the scrolls from the Judean desert. And the most important thing about them, and there are many, many things, is that they provide us with our earliest biblical texts that we have. Prior to the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1947, the only ancient biblical text that we had from that same period was this, called the Nash Papyrus, which was found in Egypt. It's called Nash after a British scholar who was the one who bought it in Cairo. And the Nash Papyrus is got the 10 Commandments on it. And interestingly enough, it's a combination of the 10 Commandments from both Exodus and Deuteronomy, kind of mashed together. And it has the first paragraph of the Shema. So before 1947, this was the oldest biblical text, and it's just a fragment, just a little bit. So what happened in 1947 was that some Bedouins found in caves in the Judean desert near the Dead Sea some scrolls. And they didn't know what they were, and there's a long story associated with this, but eventually they made their way they were sold and resold and resold. And what happened was there were a series of excavations. Now, at that time, this area was under Jordanian rule, and after 1948. And there were a series of excavations that occurred there in the 1950s and 60s that found all the different caves in which there were both scrolls and fragments, thousands of fragments. Ultimately, 972 texts were identified, separate texts, but there are literally tens of thousands of fragments because in some places they're just little tiny pieces. And what happened was that the site near the caves was also excavated. And after 1967, when Israel occupied, now the scrolls found, some of them were bought and put in the Rockefeller Museum, which is in East Jerusalem, and some of them were acquired by Israeli scholars and were put into the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. After 1967, except for the copper scroll, which I'll show you in a minute, and a few other things, all of the scrolls were taken over by the Israeli government and eventually housed in a special museum called the Shrine of the Book. And I'm sure many of you have been to the Shrine of the Book. But what happened was the Israelis then started to look in the whole region around where the scrolls were found. And the scrolls were found at this place called Qumran. Here's Jerusalem. And the landscape is this, as you know, the Dead Sea is the lowest point on earth. There's a rift valley, so there's a sharp drop, and there are cliffs. And the scrolls and the fragments were found in caves in the cliffs nearby the archaeological site of Qumran, which itself has gone through several excavations. What I'm going to talk about tonight really is about the biblical manuscripts and the biblical aspect. I'm not telling you the whole story of Qumran. who the people were who wrote it. That's the next course. But we will touch upon some of it. But when the Israeli scholars did this massive search of the area, they found material at several different places. And when Yigal Yadin excavated Masada in the early 60s, there was material that was found at Masada as well. So when we talk about these, generally the Dead Sea Scrolls, we're actually talking about a whole bunch of different things. And if you take a look at what I've given you, you will see where the scrolls were found, but also what was found there. So the first one, and I'm going to mispronounce this, Wadi el Dalia, they found Sumerian legal papyri, which means from the Samaritans, and these are not biblical texts, and they're very old, they date from the 4th century BCE. At Qumran itself, manuscripts of 190 biblical books, reflecting 3 textual families, and some people date the earliest of the biblical manuscripts to around 250 BCE, and the end date is 68 because that's when Qumran was destroyed by the Romans during the war. Yes, Dan?
What do you mean by textual families?
You will see. I will get to that. At Wadi Murabarat, Ba'at, they found some biblical manuscripts, including texts of the minor prophets, and these dated from after 70, but no later than 135 because of the Bar Kokhba revolt. In another cave, Nahal Hever, they found copies of translations of the minor prophets in Greek, fragments of Psalms. This is where they found the letters of Bar Kokhba. In other words, this dates to the Bar Kokhba revolt. Bar Kokhba himself may have been in this cave. And they found other stuff as well. In Nahal Se'elim, they found non-biblical papyri and fragments in Greek. And then at Masada, biblical fragments no later than 73, because that's when Masada was destroyed. It may have been destroyed a few years earlier, actually. So these are all the various sources of the manuscripts that are generally referred to as the Dead Sea Scrolls, although usually when you say that, you're primarily talking about the ones found at Qumran. And when you look at the main scrolls, that's what you're looking at. So at Qumran, there's a number of caves, as you see. There are 11 caves in which manuscripts or fragments have been found. And here, Khirbet Qumran is the site of the ruins of the settlement. And the caves are in the cliffs all around, and here's the Dead Sea. Okay? This is what the cliffs look like. This is Cave 4. So you can imagine these are not very easily accessible in some cases. Maybe that needs to be adjusted slightly. Okay. Here is a picture of the ruins of the settlement at Qumran. And it's been very extensively discussed, and there's a lot of arguments over when it was settled and why, who lived there and what they were doing. But the general consensus now is that the people who who were responsible for putting the scrolls in the caves were from this place. Here is sort of a map of the whole settlement. Yes, Stu?
I'm sorry if I missed it at the beginning, but the people who put the manuscripts in the caves, were they the ones who wrote them?
Some of them, for sure. This is a reconstruction of what in this picture is called the Essene settlement at Qumran. And they had an extensive water system with mikvahs and so on and so forth. So some of the scrolls were found inside large pottery jars. And that's one of the reasons why they were preserved. This is the inside of Cave 4. And it seems that some of the caves, Cave 4 in particular, were actual places where people went and lived. So and some of the caves it would appear that the scrolls were very carefully put in there, and other ones they were not. And the caves where they were finding thousands of fragments may in fact be as a result of a fire that was set by the Roman attack.
Were these used at all?
Yes. You mean the scrolls?
Yes.
Oh yes, they were absolutely used by the community there. But it could be, and I'm going to use this word advisedly, that some of these caves were the equivalent of monastic cells or hermitages, where somebody would go to be alone for a while. The biggest scroll that we found, and the most complete, is a scroll of Isaiah, the great Isaiah scroll, which dates from around 125 BCE. It's incredible, and it's the big one that you see that goes around the center of the shrine of the book. Here's what it looks like as a scroll. And it's indicative of the fact that a large part of the material found at Qumran are biblical manuscripts, the earliest biblical manuscripts that we have. And here is the division of the material at Qumran. 40% of the texts are from the Hebrew Bible, whether large scale like the Isaiah scroll or even tiny fragments. Another 30% are texts from the Second Temple period of books that were not canonized in the Hebrew Bible. And we talked about that last week, including the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Book of Tobit, Ben Sira, some Psalms that didn't make it into the book but are just as old as the other Psalms. So, and then 30% are sectarian manuscripts of previously unknown document that shed light on the rules and beliefs of a particular group or groups within Judaism. And these are the community rule, or also known as the Damascus document, the war scroll, and what's called the Pesher, which is a commentary on the prophet Habakkuk. And our next series of lectures, we will look at the sectarian works and examine them to try and understand who were the people who wrote them, and what was this community doing there. So here is, and you have it on page 2 of your material, the biblical books in the Dead Sea Scrolls. These are the ones at Qumran. These are the ones from other desert sites like Masada. And the numbers here are the number of manuscripts and what script they were in. Okay? Now, if you look at this list here is all of the books of the Hebrew Bible. Do you notice something about one of them?
Esther.
No manuscripts of the book of Esther. Does that mean the people at Qumran didn't believe that Esther should be in the Bible? It's quite possible, given the fact that all the other books are represented in one way or another. Now, when you look at it, what do you see as being the most prominent books by virtue of the number of copies there are?
Psalms
Well, yes, the book of Psalms, definitely.
and Deuteronomy.
Deuteronomy, Isaiah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus. That doesn't surprise us, does it? Because those are the books of the Torah. But evidently they had them as separate. Sometimes in some of the scrolls you have more than one book. But yes, the fact that Psalms is so prominent is interesting. There's also eight different fragments of or parts of the book of Daniel, which is quite interesting. Also the fact that there are bits in the book of Daniel that don't exist in our text that are in the Qumran Daniel. Yes, Stu, you had a question.
I think it was last week you said that the feeling against Esther was that it doesn't have God's name in it.
Yes, exactly.
Is that the situation here?
Probably, and also it's possible that Purim was not celebrated by this group. Okay? So the point is, unlike the Jews of Alexandria who altered the book of Esther to include God, the Hebrew that was never done to the Hebrew copy. Now you'll also notice that the scripts, I mentioned this last time, so the square or Aramaic script, you see that's most of the manuscripts are in that, but some of the are written in the Old Hebrew script, which is quite interesting, isn't it? Now when you look at the other Judean desert sites, you see these are other biblical manuscripts that have been found, which I pointed out before, from a variety of places and a variety of times. Yes,
So
Charles?
does the number give the number of pieces or fragments, or is it the actual volume of text?
It's partial. They're all partial. Like even the Isaiah scroll is not complete. So it's number of scrolls or fragments or pieces found. Okay.
So the number may not actually reflect how much information.
Right.
Okay.
Right. In other words, 19 manuscripts of Genesis. I don't think any one of them is near complete. Okay. Yes, Dan.
But in total, do we have the complete Genesis?
I don't think so, no. I don't think so. I mean, they can tell, because these are found in different caves, and they are different hands that wrote them, okay? Here is one of the most important of the non-biblical manuscripts. It's called the Temple Scroll. It's older than any of the sectarian texts that were written by the group at Qumran. It predates them. And this is going to be, the Temple Scroll is extremely interesting when it comes to talking about the canonization of the Torah, because this text purports to be almost like another Torah or a piece of divine revelation. And before Qumran, nobody knew about this text. Okay? Here's one of the most mysterious things found at Qumran, which is in Amman, because the Jordanians kept it in their capital. It's called the Copper Scroll. It was this is the reconstruction up here, and this is the actual pieces here. It was a rolled up copper. That's a picture of when it looked like when it was found. And the only way they could unroll it was to cut it into these columns, and then they were able to read it.
What's the scale of this? How big is it?
This big. Here's a close-up of it somewhat. Nobody knows exactly what this is. It seems to be a catalog of sites of treasure. And people have actually identified some of the places in it and tried to go and see if there's anything there. Well, there isn't. And so the big question is, what treasure are they talking about? It is a real treasure, it is a fake treasure. And many scholars believe, in fact, that it is a catalog, and why it was at Qumran, nobody has any idea, of the treasury in the temple. And when you add it up, it's an enormous amount of treasure, which is why some people don't think it's real. But the fact is, we know from ancient sources that the temple in Jerusalem had one of the largest amounts of money and treasure in the ancient world. I mean, Titus and Vespasian used it to build the Colosseum. It's true, that's where they got the money, to build the Colosseum. Okay, so who are the people who wrote this? Just very briefly, they are probably a group of people that were called in our sources that we have of this period, namely Pliny, who was a Roman historian, Josephus, and Philo are people they call the Essenes. And this text is one of the main proofs that very likely that the Essenes are to be identified with the Qumran people, although nowhere in the sectarian documents at Qumran do they call themselves the Essenes. In fact, they call themselves the Yachad, which means together, so it's another word for community. And we don't even know what the word Essene, what it means, where it came from in Greek. But if you take a look at Pliny's, part of his natural history, he's describing the Dead Sea, okay, which is what he calls the Ashphalites. He talks about a group called the Esseni, a people that live apart from the world and marvelous beyond all others, and he talks about this group of ascetics. Well, the place that he's talking about west of the Dead Sea, it's almost for sure is Qumran. Okay? And he describes a little bit about them. And he talks about how it's not far from Masada, which is also true. But we don't know for sure if the two are matched. We just don't know. And there's a lot of theories about it, but that'll be the next series. But very likely what we have is, at Qumran, a group of Jewish ascetics, a group of monks, essentially, Jewish monks, who are living in a desert area, and that in itself is not unusual. There's a theme about living off in the desert to escape the impurity of civilization. We probably know why they went there. We probably know, what caused them to do this. We know they were there from the 1st century BCE, and we know that the community was destroyed by the Romans during the war around 68 CE. And very likely the texts were hidden in the caves when the Romans were coming to attack the settlement. Now, why did the Romans care about them? Because, according to Josephus, if he's correct, some of the Essenes participated in the leadership of the rebels against the Romans. And also the Romans were not terribly discriminate about who they killed when they were suppressing a revolt. They would often just go into a town and slaughter everybody. The point is, if you find it odd that we have a group of Jewish monastics, it wasn't so unusual back then. And this, in fact, was the mother house, if it is the Essenes. It's the mother house of the Essenes, because Essenes had little settlements in cities and towns around ancient Judea and the Galilee. But this may have been the place where their main place. Very likely, it's a good chance, by the way, that John the Baptist was one of them and was at Qumran at some point. It's a possibility, but we'll talk more about that before. In the material that I gave you, just to show you a little bit about the way, how fascinating this is in terms of biblical stuff, if you look at page 2 at the bottom, this is one of the apocryphal Psalms. In other words, this is a psalm written in good biblical Hebrew that has been called by scholars Psalm 151. There are 150 psalms in the book of Psalms. And when you read it, it sounds like any of the other psalms. A Psalm of David talking about his life. It's highly likely, and there are others like this. There's a few more. This was not written by the people at Qumran. They had their own prayers and stuff that they wrote. There's actually quite a bit of material from them that's liturgical. So this sheds light on the fact that and something that we knew was very likely, that our 150 psalms were a selection of a much larger corpus. That's one of the fascinating things, and it tells us a lot about the canonization of the Torah, of the Tanakh, how the Hebrew Bible bit by bit came together. So when you look at the texts at Qumran, you find, first of all, that there's Hebrew from the period. There's biblical Hebrew in some of the texts because they're biblical manuscripts. There is Aramaic, and there is Greek. There are a few Greek texts, and there are a few Nabatean texts. And the Nabateans were a group of people who lived in the area, but were not Jewish. The script, the Assyrian block script, is the script we have today. I showed that to you last week, right? It's essentially the same as the one we use today. There apparently are some things called cryptic scripts, which they were ciphers, written texts that they didn't want anybody to be able to read, and nobody's been able to decipher them. Okay, there's very few of them. What's interesting is you have biblical manuscripts that are written in the Old Hebrew text. Again, sometimes you have a mix, right? Some of it's written in a scribal script, which is a kind of cursive version of the Old Hebrew. So you have some manuscripts, again, very, very few of that. The Aramaic are written in the Aramaic alphabet, which I showed you was similar to, but not exact to the what's called the Assyrian block script here. All right. And this Greek is a standard sort of scribal Greek alphabet that was utilized in the ancient world. And so you find a few manuscripts, and the Nabatean script is very similar to the Aramaic script. Anybody have any questions at this point?
What is the basis for the different types of scripts that are used in the same period of time?
Well, the biblical manuscripts, it shows you that some people were very conservative and didn't want to use was a more recent alphabet that was not the original biblical Hebrew manuscript. So I showed you last week that in some manuscripts, you see them using the Syrian block script, but every time the name of God is mentioned, the Yud-He-Vav-He, they use the Paleo-Hebrew, the original Hebrew. So it has to do with a kind of religious conservatism. But it also shows you how there was a transition between a time when all Hebrew manuscripts were written in the original Hebrew manuscript and how it changed over to the other alphabet, which is derived from the Aramaic, and that transition would have started in the Persian Empire, which is several hundred years before this. But it shows you that even by the 1st century BCE, 250 years or so after the Jews were no longer under the Persians, how some people were continuing to utilize it in that way. Okay? Yes, Dan.
Pliny says the folks at Qumran were there for 1,000 years.
Yeah, well, of course, he didn't. He's wrong. Yeah, he's exaggerating. Yeah. Well, dates. It's difficult. Yeah.
But it seems to me that one could reasonably interpret that as saying they were there for a while.
Well, that's a big question. There's a lot of argument about when that settlement started. We know when it ended. That's easy.
Yeah.
But when it started, did it start in the 2nd century BCE or did it start in the early 1st century BCE? I'll deal with that the next time, but because it really sort of, it kind of goes to the origin of this group. How did they get started? And there's more than one theory about that. And I don't think that's been resolved, by the way.
And it may also have to do with what scripts they were using.
Yes.
And if they were there for a couple hundred years.
Yeah, could be. But also we know that they had texts that they didn't write that predated them. And in some cases, we don't know who wrote the Temple Scroll. It's a very sectarian book, but they didn't write it. They liked it, obviously. They had several manuscripts of it, but they didn't write it. So some earlier group wrote it. We don't know who. So when you look at the biblical texts at Qumran, you essentially have 4 different kinds of biblical texts. You have what's called the Proto-Masoretic, and 40%, the largest amount of biblical texts are what's called Proto-Masoretic, meaning if you take them and you compare it to the standard Masoretic text at 1,000 years later, they are very much the same. That includes the Great Isaiah Scroll. It's really interesting. And by the way, if you want to look at some of these things, there is a whole project that has been digitalizing all the Dead Sea Scrolls. You can go online. If you look up digital Dead Sea Scrolls, you can go click on the Isaiah Scroll, and it has a picture of it. You can go to every single column of it, and when you click on it, it'll tell you a translation of the verse. Okay, so you can actually look at it, and several of the sectarian scrolls, like the Temple Scroll and the War Scroll, are also up online. So it's really quite amazing to do that. But the Proto-Masoretic shows that the Masoretic tradition before the Masoretes, that the consonantal text is a very old text. All right, the fact that that 1,000 biblical manuscripts that are 1,000 years earlier than the codexes of the Masoretes show basically it's the same tradition. Now, the second kind are what's called I love this word, Septuagintal, meaning there are a significant number of manuscripts that are not part of the tradition that goes to the Masoretic, but is the original Hebrew that underlies the Septuagint, the Jewish Greek translation of the Bible. In other words, when the Jews of Alexandria translated the Torah from Hebrew into Greek, they had a different manuscript tradition than the one that leads to the Masoretic. And that's the reason why there are differences between the Septuagint's version of biblical texts and the Masoretic texts. Does everybody get that? This is really important because it tells us a lot about the composition of these texts. I think I mentioned to you last week that when you look at the Septuagint's version of the book of Jeremiah, it's 30% shorter than the Hebrew Masoretic version. And that may actually reflect two different original editions of the book of Jeremiah that may go back to the time of Jeremiah himself, because we have some evidence that in fact that during his own life there were two editions of his book that were written down, or his sayings. Now, number 3 is called the pre-Samaritan. There are a small number of manuscripts. I mentioned last time that the Samaritans have their own Pentateuch. It's written in a script that's very much like the Old Hebrew script. In it, they made some changes to indicate that they believe that the temple should not have been built in Jerusalem, but in their center, which is now near Nablus today. So what you find in the Dead Sea Scrolls is texts that reflect the Samaritans' Torah, but don't mention the changes they made. So in other words, it seems to be before those changes were made. Because the Samaritans existed at the time of the Dead Sea community, and some of their manuscripts could have been floating around, but evidently those editorial insertions were a little later than this. Yes?
The modern Samaritans, do they still worship a version of the Hebrew Bible?
Yes, they only have the Torah, you see. They don't have the rest of the Tanakh. They have their own version of the Torah written in a script that looks like the old Hebrew script. And they read from it, and yes.
Similar customs about reading Torah?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Samaritans have a very complicated history of their own, and there aren't that many of them. Okay? There's only a few thousand of them left. But in the days of the Qumran community, they were a significant community in the area that we call the northern West Bank, Samaria. And they were in conflict with the Jews. And it's one of the... There's a long story about them about that. Okay?
Different class.
Yeah. Now, in addition, there seems to be texts which don't seem to be part of any of these other traditions. Sometimes they seem to be kind of rough and ready scribal things, or, not very carefully written, almost like, more popular versions of things that depart significantly from the other texts, including one they call the reworked Pentateuch, which is essentially a paraphrase. Which, by the way, we have several biblical paraphrases of Second Temple Jewish literature. So it's interesting that some of these texts just don't belong to any of this stuff. And so what does it tell you that you have these 4 different manuscript traditions at Qumran?
There's a lot going on. I mean, a lot of fractured groups.
This text had not been set.
And we're looking at a library.
Well, yes, the text had not been set. Now, what's interesting is, if you go back to the map that on the page 1, you'll see that there are some biblical manuscripts that were found that date from the time of the Bar Kokhba revolt, right? The one that says biblical manuscripts including minor prophets in Hebrew, 70 to 135, and the other one, minor prophets in Greek, fragments of Psalms. When you look at those texts, they are all part of the Proto-Masoretic, which shows that by the 2nd century CE, the Hebrew manuscript tradition had been set pretty much, and so that when the Masoretes came along, it was already well established as to what the Hebrew text was. The Septuagint Hebrew had disappeared, essentially. So we can actually see the development of the Masoretic text before the Masoretes. Some people call that, instead of Proto-Masoretic, Proto-Rabbinic, but I think Proto-Masoretic is more accurate. And that tells us a lot about how the texts evolved. So here's an example of how this works. We have fragments, parts of the book of Exodus. Considerable number. We don't have a whole, big scroll. We got lots of fragments of the books of Exodus in the Dead Sea Scrolls. When you look at the Qumran, you find one, especially in Cave 4, called 4Q Exodus, you find that it is the Hebrew that underlies the Septuagint. And when you look at some other parts of it, you find, here it's called Proto-Rabbinic, that it is the Masoretic tradition. Now, scholars tend to designate this as the old Palestinian textual family, meaning the textual tradition from Eretz Yisrael, and the Babylonian textual family. In other words, when you go back, again, we don't actually have these texts. But here, the archetype of the book of Exodus, somewhere around when the book of Exodus reached its final edition, which would have been by the 6th century BCE, maybe later, it then splits, Jews in Babylon, because don't forget, even when the Jews came back from Babylon, most of them stayed behind. And you have the Jews of Eretz Yisrael. So this theory is actually proven by the texts at Qumran, because the 4Q Exodus texts are underlying the Septuagint, and you can actually do comparisons of the Septuagint Exodus text, the Masoretic Exodus text, and the fragments at Qumran, and you can see that there's obviously, it follows the Septuagint. Anybody have any questions about this? This is very important for learning about how the Torah got composed. What? Yes, they are at the time, yes. Now, if you take a look on page 4 of what I've given you, this is what's called 4Q22. This is from the Septuagint Hebrew, and these are pieces of Exodus chapter 6 from verses 25 to chapter 7, verse 19. Now, the point is, if you try to match this up with text we have it, there are breaks in this because it's fragments. It's not just a straight piece of paper. But the point is, you will actually see there are if you put this and the Septuagint translated into English and the Masoretic translation, you will see there are differences, and this one and the Septuagint are similar. Yeah.
But the differences you're talking about are differences of a few words, a phrase here or there.
Yes.
But of the same material.
Yes.
It's not as if we're talking about a book is different, or another book got sort of squeezed in or squeezed out or something.
No. Although there is an interesting fragment found at Qumran, which supposedly is the Song of Miriam. In other words, this may in fact be an authentic piece of biblical text that didn't make it into the book of Exodus, that, as you know, after the song at the sea in Exodus 15, it then says Miriam came out with the women and they sang, and it's got like 2 little lines. Well, there's a text that has like a 10-line song of Miriam, and some people think it may go back to an original tradition that didn't make it into the book of Exodus. It's quite possible. Anybody have any other questions about this? So the other thing that we find at Qumran are some translations. In other words, there were obviously some members of the community were Greek-speaking. They had evidence of 2 scrolls of Leviticus, 1 of Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Now, there's not full scrolls, again, pieces. And there are fragments of Aramaic translations of Leviticus in the book of Job. In addition to this, there's also biblical texts that are quoted in the sectarian literature. And when you get, for example, the Pesher Habakkuk is a midrashic commentary on the prophet Habakkuk. It's a very important text for learning about the community itself. It quotes the verses. So this is another way of trying to understand what's going on there. So, what does this tell us about the canonization of the Bible? Well, I mentioned to you before that there are fragments of the book of Daniel that has material there that does not appear in the Hebrew book of Daniel and doesn't appear in the Greek translation of the book of Daniel. The Greek translation of the book of Daniel is larger than the Masoretic Hebrew, and they are now listed in the Apocrypha as additions to Daniel. Okay, so what does that show? It shows that there was a different edition of the book of Daniel. And here, Dan, we can actually say there are actual differences, new material or different material in there. Well, it turns out there's even more material. Now, Daniel is probably the last book of the Tanakh that we know of that was edited. We can pretty well date it to the early, either just before or just at the breakout of the Maccabean revolt around 164 BCE. That's when the book of Daniel was edited together. Some of the material is earlier and some of it is contemporary. But it's evident that it really wasn't set yet, and that even by the time of Qumran, which is probably 100 years later, there were different versions of it floating around. So this shows, and again, I showed you with the Psalms, how we have other Psalms. So the Dead Sea Scrolls are incredibly important in trying to understand the fact that until the time of the 1st century CE, when we see this kind of more uniformity coming in, there are different traditions, biblical traditions that are out there, and there was no set text. Okay? Anybody have any questions about this at this point? Yes, Stu.
I don't know if you can generalize, but the differences in the versions.
Yeah.
Is there a theme in the?
Not necessarily.
More a reference to God.
No.
Less.
No, there are
random changes.
they're not random. They're not mistakes. They represent different ways of saying the same thing in some cases, or some cases there are material that's just in one that's not in the other. Like in the Qumran Daniel, there are stories about Daniel that don't appear in the Masoretic version or in the Septuagint version. Okay?
Is there a different point of view about Daniel?
No, just additional material of the same stuff. Okay? Yeah.
We Daniels are complex. But, no, I forgot my question.
It's okay. So, I mean, when you look at the Masoretic text, there are words and passages that are difficult to understand that represent transmission problems. And so sometimes when you go back if you have a piece of Qumran, it may actually show you what was originally there that somehow got lost in the shuffle. There's actually there's a place in the book of Samuel, first book of Samuel, where when you look at the Masoretic, there's obviously a blank there, okay, where somebody was supposed to be saying something and it's just not there. And when you look at the version of Samuel that was found in Qumran, the fragments, it's got it. Okay? I mean, look in Genesis chapter 3, Genesis chapter 4, where the Cain and Abel story is. Yeah. There's a blank there because it says they went out to the field and said to one another and then like nothing. Okay? And I'm not sure, but there could be somewhere in one of these ancient manuscripts where it got filled in. Now, in the case of the Septuagint, if it got filled in, it was probably, somebody wrote it in to interpret it, right? But there are many places where we know there are mistakes in the Masoretic text. We know there are scribal errors that have crept into the text and then just got recopied and recopied and recopied, where there was a confusion between a resh and a daled, or a hey and a chet. And we also see there are repetitions of lines. As one of my teachers said, the scribe was writing and he went up to get a cup of coffee and he came back and he forgot where he had been writing and he just started over again. Okay, that's called ditography. And you can go, sometimes the Qumran manuscripts can help us understand those mistakes. There's also a couple of places in the Hebrew, well, more than a couple, but even in the Torah itself, where it's evident that somebody wrote something in the margin of a manuscript, and then a later scribe incorporated it into the text. Okay, it's in the plagues, by the way. There's one of the texts of the plagues. It's evident that there's a verse there that somebody wrote in the manuscript to explain it like a commentary, because it was not, the sense of it was difficult. So he said, well, this is what it means. Yeah.
My memory is sort of failing me on this, but I seem to remember seeing a book where someone attempted to take the Bible and place it into those planks
Yes.
that are in the Qumran.
I honestly don't know that part myself. Yeah.
And I think I have that, I just don't remember.
So when we go backwards from Qumran, we are moving back towards the time of the actual composition of the books themselves. Qumran is very good, by the way, in helping us with the notion of how the prophets got composed, edited, and put into the Bible. I pointed out the whole thing with Jeremiah. We have several parts of the book of Jeremiah in the Qumran, and they tend to follow the Septuagint's version of Jeremiah. They are part of the Proto-Septuagint material. So we know that by the 1st century BCE, there were still other versions, that the composition of the books of the prophets were not 100% set. It's evident that the Psalms were not 100% set. It's evident that the rest of the books, Esther's not there, Daniel's not quite the same. In other words, you don't get that sense of complete uniformity until the 1st century CE. And you see that in the manuscripts from the time of Bar Kokhba. So we're pushing it backwards now. We're digging deeper in our archaeological tell. So what does this tell us? It tells us that the notion of canonization, of declaring sacred texts, is something that was not yet set. And one of the other things that we learn from this is from these sectarian scrolls. In other words, did the people at Qumran consider the temple scroll to be as sacred as the books of Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers? Because that's actually what it covers. Did they consider the book of Jubilees to be sacred? Did they consider the book of Enoch to be sacred? We don't know. But the fact that they had them there showed that in some ways they had to have venerated them because they predated them. They didn't write those books. How much of the material that we know that they very likely wrote did they consider to be sacred? Now, a couple of the books that they wrote are not supposed to be considered as what we would call Torah scrolls, but essentially the Manual of Discipline, or the Community Rule as it's called, is a handbook on how do you get to be a member, essentially, initiations and so on. So the Community Rule, the Manual of Discipline is another book. These are not necessarily what we would call sacred literature. They're more like these are the rules of the community. There are other books. There are apocalyptic books, like the what's called the War Scroll. Its full name is the War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness. Now, was this considered to be a kind of apocalyptic sacred vision like you have in the book of Daniel, or you have in other Jewish books of apocalyptic visions that we know about that don't come from Qumran, that are part of the pseudepigrapha? We don't know. Okay? Because nowhere in Qumran do we have a list what we consider sacred, what we don't consider sacred. We just have all these books, which is why some scholars actually believe that you don't have a sectarian settlement. What you have is somebody had this incredible library of all these ancient texts and tried to save them during the war. Most people don't believe that now. The archaeological evidence is pretty clear now that the books at Qumran were written at Qumran, or at least they were copied at Qumran. We actually know which room they were written in. They found an inkwell there. They found benches. And very likely they were removed from the settlement because of the war and put in the caves to try and preserve them. So there was a huge operation going on of the of the copying of texts and which texts they considered what we would call biblical and which they didn't, we don't know 100%. Does anybody have any questions at this particular point? What we're going to go next week is we are actually now then going to go into the composition of the Torah text itself. And we're going to deal with what's called the documentary hypothesis, which is a theory that dates from late 19th, early 20th, late 19th century about the sources that underlie the Torah itself, and when they were written and who wrote them, so to speak. It's a very complicated and not always, not everybody agrees on a lot of these things, but it's a radical departure from the traditional idea that the entire Torah was given by God to Moses, word for word and letter for letter on Mount Sinai. But we'll take that next week, and so in the meantime, I wish you a happy and healthy and sweet New Year. Shana Tova Metuka.